I'm Brian Foster, and this is the Grindhouse Institute. On each episode of this podcast, Jeremy Floyd and I program a triple feature movie night. Each of the movies share common themes, and we discuss them here. We're happy you could join us for another entry in our inspiring series we call Inspiring Reservoir Dogs. After a long month of beating ourselves over the head with blood, guts, and all the ooey gooey things that come with the horror genre, we decided to cleanse the palate, a respite, if you will, from the ultra-violence and mayhem. And what better way to cleanse that palate than by watching Reservoir Dogs, a film known for its ultra-violence and mayhem. Yeah. Today we're diving into two films that were clear inspirations for the incredibly popular 1992 Quentin Tarantino film. Our block takes us all the way back to the 50s with a film noir about a gang of bank robbers who don't know each other's names, into the late 80s with a film about an undercover cop who was pushed deep into a gang's nefarious plans only to end up in a Mexican standoff. Sound familiar? And I feel like this is a good time to, yet again, do something that I have always wanted to do. K. Bryan's super cinema of the 50s weekend just keeps on truckin' with this little ditty that was released in November of 1952. The Phil Coulson film, Kansas City Confidential. K. Bryan's super cinema of the 80s continues. You watched Day of the Dead by Romero and Return of the Living Dead by Dan O'Bannon. And if you're the 12th caller, you'll win 2 tickets to the Hong Kong action extravaganza being held tonight at the Carson Fairgrounds featuring Ringo Lam's film 1987's City on Fire. Quentin Tarantino, Michael Bodnerchek, and Lawrence Bender were a trio known as a band apart when they produced this Dylan-esque pop bubblegum favorite from January of '92 that reached up to number 1 as K. Bryan's Super Sounds of the 90s continues with Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. The 12th caller wins on the podcast where the Grindhouse survives. KBRIN. I love doing this show. Thank you so much for listening to the Grindhouse Institute. Please enjoy.
You said yourself you thought about taking him out.
Fucking said that.
Yeah, I did, okay? I did. But that was then. Right now, this guy is the only one I completely trust.
Now, you two boys make like friends. Go to sleep. In case you get any ideas about visiting me later, forget it. I sleep light.
All right, welcome back to the Grindhouse Institute. I'm Brian Foster. With me, as always, is Jeremy Floyd. How's it going?
I'm just sitting here, stuck in the middle with you.
Oh, yes. Steelers Wheel. With that little ditty.
This Dylan-esque pop tune.
Pop bubblegum. As you can guess, we are watching Pulp Fiction today. Nope. We are watching... Yeah, exactly.
Son of a bitch.
A very special episode, as if they haven't been so special up to now. We have a very special guest on with us again, a returning guest.
That's right. Returning champion, Andy Buigues.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. This makes sense because, we have to have, repeat guests, and this is kind of a sequel to a previous episode. So we got a sequel, we've got repeat guests, we've got cast of characters playing different roles. This is a real serious theatrical thing we've got going on here. Today we're going to be talking about films that inspired Reservoir Dogs. And we are also going to be talking about Reservoir Dogs. But those films are Kansas City Confidential from 1952, City on Fire from 1987, and then Reservoir Dogs from, was it 92?
Yeah.
92.
1992.
92, yeah. So, let's talk about why we put these together, obviously, outside of the obvious stuff right there. But, yeah.
Right. As I'm sure everyone's aware, Quentin Tarantino likes to be influenced very strongly from other places, and Reservoir Dogs is no exception. There's plenty of films we could have gone down, like Better Tomorrow 2, also from 1987, also starring Chow Yun-fat. The wardrobe in that movie is exactly what the guys are wearing throughout Reservoir Dogs. We could have done maybe The Killing, the Kubrick movie, with our good friend
Hayden.
Sterling Hayden. And, maybe just because of the flashback structure and kind of getting to know each criminal in that. Maybe taking the Pelham 123, the color-coded nicknames, Mr.
Pink and
Orange and Mr. Blue and all this. Or maybe Django with the ear slicing. But I think those are more sort of straight homage or, little references to those movies. Whereas I think these movies have a lot more borrowed themes, a lot more borrowed, plot points and more direct references. Obviously, City on Fire, which we'll get to, the sort of third act, but also some stuff from Kansas City Confidential. Perhaps what he borrowed from each is a little different, sort of qualitatively as well.
Sure.
But I think in terms of if you're gonna try to pick some movies that influence this one, I think these are the ones to point to.
I agree, and while there are some things that he might have done, even close to the original, some of it was right on the nose, shot for shot, carbon copy. But again, he did it in his way. We talked about Star Wars and how films inspired Star Wars, and Tarantino does make things his own while paying sometimes one-to-one comparison tribute to the original.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, what was interesting from my perspective is that I, was very familiar with Reservoir Dogs. I think as a film student in the early 2000s, very much influenced by Tarantino, or at least, kind of aware and admiring his style. And it was interesting to go back to these films, which Jeremy had mentioned to me before that had influenced Tarantino, but to go back and actually watch them and see kind of those direct links was pretty fascinating.
Was this your first time seeing these films, or?
Yes. Yeah. I mean,
great.
Jeremy and I have gone through a lot of film noirs, but Kansas City Confidential was not one that I had seen before, and ended up being
right.
Aside kind of from the research for this podcast, ended up being a really good film on its own. So it was really,
agreed.
Really exciting to watch. Yeah.
It was very good. I mean, we should get into it because, I mean, like you said, film noir. It's an old 50s film noir film. It's got some great performances in it. Lee Van Cleef is in it, and he plays a great character, Mr. Romano or Tony Romano, I think his name is. And
I know it's funny. The whole time I was telling Jeremy, man, I kept watching this movie, and by the end of it, I felt pretty dumb because I kept watching it and was thinking, man, that guy looks like a young Lee Van Cleef. And I kept thinking, man, that guy really does look like Lee Van Cleef. And then when the credits...
He sounds like him, too.
He sounds like him, yeah. And when the credits rolled, I was like, that was Lee Van Cleef. I'm just used to seeing him so much older. It was funny.
Yeah, exactly. And so much bolder, too.
Escape from New York, calling Pliskin and all that with his earring in that movie.
Yeah.
Nobody gives a shit about you, Pliskin.
Call me Snake.
I don't give a shit about your president or your war.
It's interesting because he has a particular quality to his voice, and I always just assumed it was because of the ADR in the spaghetti westerns, but it was actually very similar to what he sounded like in those movies.
Yeah, no, exactly. That is his voice. That's not just someone dubbing him. I mean, it's funny because, it's sticking with Lee Van Cleef for a second, it's I think, aside from maybe, Escape from New York or something, he's most well known for his spaghetti western stuff. I mean, obviously Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, A Few Dollars More, but also his Zapata stuff. It's the Italian production style is you shoot and you do the audio later. Don't worry about it, folks.
Kind of.
And obviously that was also the Hong Kong style in City on Fire, which we'll get to. But it's funny because you just assume that everyone's dub voice is a little bit different, but it's no, that's exactly what his voice sounded like.
Yeah. But great in this role is kind of this dangerous criminal / ladies man. It's pretty great.
Yeah, womanizer in a way, very slick. Very cool. So this is about a fella named Joe who is he's a veteran from World War II. down on his luck. He's an ex-con. Joe Rolfe is his name. He's wrapped up into this crazy-ass plot, very similar in, when you think about Reservoir Dogs. So, we'll talk about some connections there. A group of criminals are brought together by one person. In this instance, his name's Mr. Big, or that's how he goes by. And all the criminals are forced to wear masks.
Listen, Kelly, I don't want you to touch her. I won't, Mr. Big. That's all I can think about when I thought about Mr. Big. or maybe it's Wayne's World.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
We need to go back to Aurora.
Come up through Wisconsin. He had a lot of information for a security guard.
Yeah, that's what it was.
So Joe gets wrapped up into this as he's trying to work a normal life as a florist, or drives a florist truck, and this truck is used as a decoy, and he's used as a patsy in this. It's a bank heist for the whopping sum of $1.2 million. Yeah, between four guys, that's $300K a piece there, guys. That's a big cut. Which was
$52 too.
It's life-changing, though.
I'm sure, yeah, especially then.
Yeah.
But he gets kind of pulled through it pretty bad by the cops in this
quick,
one.
That too. But I think the money thing is an interesting part to focus on, because it's like, in some film noirs, they're doing something for like $10,000, and it's like, okay, you think about $10,000 in today's money, okay, but even then, $10,000 is like, it seems like a good chunk then, but it doesn't seem to be this complete life-altering amount of money that this was.
Right.
I mean, everyone's getting $300,000 each to do this score, and especially if they're going to continue living in Mexico like that, I mean, they're going to be able to live pretty high on the hog.
Living the sexy beast life.
Yeah. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Roasting. Broiling. Who wouldn't give this up?
Well, that element of greed, I think, is great in the movie, because it really makes you buy into this, that these guys would put themselves in such a precarious situation, like, accepting a one-way ticket to this small town in Mexico to collect their money.
And I mean, these guys this might be their last thing too, right? I mean, at least some of them are just, this is one more. It's always that one last take,
Yeah.
That
It's
last
funny,
job.
because what I was asking myself is, because they had the two satchels they rob or whatever. I was like, did they really fit $1.2 million in those things?
Those are really large bills,
Yeah,
all right?
they're $1,000 and $5,000 bills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are like treasury bills.
Exactly.
Yeah, it didn't like it. We've seen like other movies where these bank heists are huge and they're coming out with like giant. This thing
think
was,
of Heat.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I hate to break it to you, Andy, but Brian still hasn't gotten into the Heat yet.
Yeah, I got involved with this weird ass podcast, and it makes me watch like 3 other movies a week. Maybe we'll work. Maybe we'll
It's
work
weird
Heat in
how you
there.
don't have time to watch these movies. I don't understand.
Yeah, weird. Maybe we'll watch Heat due to one of the shows, and then
Yeah, we should.
It makes a lot of sense too, because I mean, in Heat they're robbing like 12 million, and that's supposed to be like the biggest hike. And
Yeah, exactly.
even the first heist I think is only like a few million, right? In fact, they Van Sant like steals like what $400,000 or $500,000 from them, and that was the root of their conflict. So
Right, exactly.
yeah, I mean, that was interesting because at least they made the score like life changing enough where you would buy that Mr. Big would orchestrate this. Not to give away. I mean, are we giving away?
Spoil it. Oh yeah, we're totally giving it away.
Oh, okay.
People. Yeah, this is spoiler central. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mr. Big being kind of a retired or a cop forced into retirement, and then orchestrating this caper to essentially coerce these criminals into helping him in this job, and then having them take the fall. I think that amount was kind of key in you buying into that, and then seeing how the kind of greed by all the criminals drives them throughout the film.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, I just love the stories of 4 guys on a heist. By the end, everyone's killing each other off, or somehow they're dead. So there's only one way to split the end result, or maybe there's 2, and that's always the head-to-head at the end there. But yeah, I thought this story was interesting. They really didn't, and I mean, I'd say this for all the movies, they didn't really portray cops in the best light. So
it's really true. It's funny. I mentioned that to Andy the other day. I was like, all these movies definitely have that perspective of, okay, it's from the criminal's perspective, so yeah, for sure. But then all of them, or at least, Kansas City, City on Fire, both of them had the cops just like beating the shit out of an innocent guy. Like ruthlessly.
Well, not only that, but Joe in this one, he can't get any more work from it. He's dragged through the mud. His name is like ruined because of this shit. So he's like, now he needed to go find.
He gets fired because of it too.
Right.
Yeah.
He had nothing left. Nothing of his normal life that he's trying to build after being, well, I guess it was it was a minor crime, right? That he's an ex-con from.
Yeah.
It wasn't. So now this guy's trying to be on the up and up here. He's trying to live a normal
but so
life.
what? He's out of prison now. It's like, it's this weird, like, I don't know what, guilty always. It's kind of the Usual Suspects mindset where it's like, like how they get set up in the beginning.
That's interesting.
Because it's like, in America, you can never be, you
Reformed.
can never do enough time. You can never
Right.
be enough reformed. You can never vote again. It's like, you can never get a job again. It's like, it's not enough to go to prison for what you did. It's also like you're punished endlessly.
And that's how Mr. Big, as the retired police officer, ex-police officer, this is a few years since he's been on the force. Now he used that against Joe in order to make him an easy patsy for this.
Okay, so that was the interesting part. It's like, the gang had a truck that they were like, doing the schedule for the flower deliveries. They had a truck painted like the flower truck. But did they know that the flower driver was an ex-con, and so therefore the cops would just, tool on him for fucking days and like.
I thought they did, and I thought he was casing him as well. I know he was casing the time. You know how they showed him like checking off the time, but I thought he was casing
definitely the time.
The man.
Yeah,
as
I don't
well.
think he had the main character's name written down. But it is an interesting idea because part of the arc is that he starts to realize that the protagonist is one of the bystanders in his scheme. I mean, one of the fascinating things is that is kind of like the struggle that Mr. Big goes with, which is, he's justifying his act by explaining that by setting up that the criminals he's like looped into this are criminals on the run from the police, and that they essentially have it coming. But the protagonist, who's again this guy on probation that had nothing to do with it, becomes a bystander, and in a way kind of makes him realize that there is no innocent crime here, and that's why he steps in at the very end. So I think that narratively it just feels that he did not intend for that to happen, and he was just using, like you said, the truck to mislead the police.
And boy, did they get misled. And then basically beat the hell out of him like they did in Something About Mary when they beat the hell out of Ben Stiller in that interrogation. It's like, Jesus, guys.
Yeah, no, but how great was that moment when he gets out of there and they finally let him go, and he's like, thanks for nothing,
Yeah.
He's like, I said nothing.
Right,
so great.
John Payne had some good lines in this one.
He had great lines, and I was gonna say, like, now I'm kind of on this the rabbit hole of John Payne, looking up his movies that he's been in. Gone with the Wind was one of them. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
Or was I wrong by that?
You know what's funny? I was thinking about this guy, and I was like, oh man, he kind of looks like what the poor man's Cary Grant, but he was really really good in this movie.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're right. Like now I kind of want to see what else he did. And
Yeah.
I guess he was in Miracle on 34th Street.
Yeah.
That's the
what
one
it was.
I'm
He was in
thinking
that.
of. Sorry, yeah, exactly. Gone with the Wind, Miracle on 34th Street.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, part one, right? Isn't that the first one?
Yeah, it's, Civil War, Santa Claus. I don't know, same thing.
Yeah, exactly. These are metaphors we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, what's great is oftentimes in these kind of forgotten film noir films, you realize that part of the reason that maybe they aren't as memorable is just that the leading, even though the story and the film itself is pretty good, but the leading actors just don't have the screen presence to kind of carry that role. And
aren't they mostly the villains? Isn't that who really carries like a film noir? Or at least the henchmen and the look and the visual.
Yeah, there's oftentimes like kind of an imbalance, right? You'll have maybe, like you said, a good villain, like a good actor playing the villain, and then maybe the lead character is not kind of strong enough to kind of balance out the other side of the film. But in this case, I felt like John Payne had really pretty good screen presence for what this role required.
Yeah.
So that if you...
And all the villains did too, really. I mean, like
Right.
even the character actors, you know, like not just Lee Van Cleef,
Paranoid
but sort of
Pete.
like the really tough guy, the like, you know, the wall-eyed Steve Buscemi like character.
That tough guy, man. That guy was a beefcake, man. Like he didn't even fit in his suit. It looks like his tie was getting smaller as he was like standing there. He just kept getting bigger. I was like, what?
it's very humid there, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe. So,
They
Yeah,
all
but
looked very hot.
because
Yeah.
you know, Tim Foster as Mr. Big was, you know, did a great job in really kind of carrying the film.
Preston Foster.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right,
I think
Preston.
yeah.
He did such a great job in carrying the film that
Yeah.
you know, it was great to see that John Payne was able to like really hold his own when it came time to confronting the other criminals.
Yeah, I mean, you really bought everybody in this. I feel like there wasn't really any weak links. Even, you know, the what was her name, like Teresa, the one selling for $11 all the time, all the like junk. You know,
She was hilarious.
yeah, everyone, you know, like all the sort of bit parts, like you know, felt, you know, very lived in and very, you know, real and very earned or whatever. There wasn't ever like that character where it's like, oh, well, you'd have to kind of overlook this one.
No,
you know,
not at all.
Everything kind of worked. And, you know, and so Preston Foster, you know, the Mr. Big guy pushing around Pete or, you know, convincing Lee Van Cleef to join this thing and to do it all anonymously. And everyone like, okay, the heist is over. Everyone jump off this moving car now or whatever. And like
That was
you know,
crazy.
it's like,
I know.
you know,
Well, at least they got the truck to slow down a little bit, all right?
yeah, exactly. But it's like, you know, they did it in a way that like, you know, you kind of bought it that this guy was intimidating enough. He had kind of enough on them to kind of do this.
Yeah.
He was able to sort of convince them as well. You know, you really felt that like all those pieces kind of fit together is what I'm trying to say.
He was the Kaiser Soze of this
Yeah.
movie, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I wonder if Bryan Singer was influenced by this movie.
Yeah. So what was Colleen Gray the Edie Finneran?
Yeah,
this one?
actually, yeah, she's a lawyer.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. She was
Exactly.
a aspiring lawyer. Right.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
funny.
And they actually had the Kobayashi in the way of the insurance executive.
Wow.
Yeah. Who's Dave Couillon then?
Well, the other detective, right?
Yeah. The one, beating up John Payne. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. What's funny is that you see a little bit of that in Usual Suspects, right? I mean, when he's like,
totally.
"I said thanks for nothing," right? You know.
Right. And like it was updated to 1996 or whatever that was, with fucking cops.
It's actually very interesting.
Anyway, yeah, like it's cool. Like when we first get to TJ, with John Payne and he's doing his thing, trying to track down the Pete Harris guy, and you know, first of all, the device was really cool. He paid the cab driver for traka and like all that other shit, and like,
Oh yeah.
you know, trying to find all the gambling places, and then you know
Which is a cool character device, by the way, that this guy could not resist a good dice game.
Right. And that he also couldn't resist when somebody grabs his hand to chain smoke off his light or whatever.
No, I know. I love how they start going to casinos and they just end up in like just like the streets where people are just like playing dice there.
But no, I thought it was the other way around. They started with the back alley dice games and then got to the illegal casinos later.
Oh, is that right?
But because that was what you were seeing of Mexico at first, you thought maybe for a second this is going to be like a Jim Thompson's Mexico, you know, maybe not quite James Ellroy's Mexico, but you know, at least a lot more seedy. And then when we get to sort of the resort town where everybody's just hanging out, everything kind of calms back down, and like it's like, you know, it's not as let's say different as, you know, the Jim Thompson getaway.
Oh, that sounds like a
Mexico
resort
is supposed
then,
to be.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Resorts are made to not be different from what you
actually,
remember.
you're right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. where it's like TJ is supposed to be like, this it's a
because
playground for
they weren't in TJ the whole time, right? They were in TJ for the first part of his investigation, and then moved to that area,
Yeah.
which is a higher end. But I thought that it was cool how he got down there and he took basically the place of Pete Harris, the paranoid Pete Harris character,
Right.
by he followed him to where he was supposed to pick up. I'm sorry, I had trouble following this because he turns around and the cops just take him out, and it's kind of like a really quick 1-2 punch to Pete.
Well, so he's like stalking Pete, and then sort of slaps him around in his hotel room, and
which
Pete,
was a theme in this movie, by the way.
Yeah,
How easily people got slapped around. I mean,
Well,
even Lee
especially
Lee
Pete.
Van Cleef.
Oh, that's true,
Pete,
that's true,
but
that's
even
true.
Lee Van
Yeah.
Cleef.
That's true. Lee Van Cleef, got knocked around a little bit too.
He took it well though.
But Pete would get slapped around, and he would take it. And despite the fact that he told Mr. Big, I don't get slapped around this easily, and yet proceeded to be slapped around every time we saw him.
That easily.
Don't get any wrong ideas about me. I don't shove around this easy.
Which is interesting because think about this, like he slaps around these criminals and the violence is relatively weak and it compels him to speak. Think about how brutal it was what the cops were doing to him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they certainly were not pulling any punches there.
Right, in the exactly, in the portrayal of the cops here. But then it's like John Payne finds Pete Harris, Jack Elam or whatever his name is, tells him, hey, look, I got framed for this. I'm getting cut in now, assholes, and now you're gonna split it 5 ways and not 4. And then they go off to the airport the next day to fly together. Pete Harris is on one side of the airport, and what's the guy's name? Joe is on the other.
Joe Roll, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And because Joe had already taken Pete's gun, when Pete's like first instinct was just to blow away all the Mexican cops.
That's what it was.
Like the cops just lit him up, and
he's not even holding a gun.
Yeah.
He's clean.
Whoops. Better plant one real quick, guys. And then
Don't worry, I'm sure that did not make its way into the report. If that's what anybody was concerned about.
Well, none of this technically, right? There is a disclaimer or at least the prologue to this movie says that not all of these get actually put into police reports. These kinds of crimes, these strange, twisted crimes.
That is funny because, aside from the the sort of Dragnet-like cold open there with that scrolling text, what the hell was really the title of the movie supposed to be in comparison to what actually the movie, what happened in the movie?
Well, it did take place in Kansas City, right?
I mean, the first like 5 minutes of it,
right,
and then the rest was in Mexico.
Yeah,
and then no one wanted to talk about it because it was a police officer that coordinated everything, right? So that would make the force look bad, so they kept it confidential.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, doesn't that kind of make sense, right?
Yeah, but it's a little different because the focus is mainly on like the point of view of the film ends up being about John Payne's character and including his like romance with Mr. Big's daughter, and so it does seem like the title doesn't fit because it's not just about kind of this world of cases or crimes that kind of don't make the newspaper and things like that, but it does make you think a little bit about the influence that this may have had on James Ellroy in L.A. Confidential, because there in L.A. Confidential, it does kind of draw from this in terms of kind of portraying these kind of crimes and plots that go on and incidents that go on that involve the police, portray them in kind of a negative light, show them that in some cases, they're doing things that are even worse than the criminals that they're going after,
right?
But are kind of kept out of the limelight. So it's really cool to see how this may have influenced him in kind of picking the L.A. Confidential title, and even in the scope of that novel. But in this case, the kind of plot seems pretty focused on the main character the protagonist, and then Mr. Big, who's trying to carry this out. So, for example, it also reminded me when you were just mentioning about the setting when they go to the small fishing village and kind of everything changes and the movie kind of takes a breath a little bit. Didn't it remind you a little bit of Key Largo, especially like the first couple acts of Key Largo, where they're kind of arriving to Key Largo, and the other guests have no idea that the mobsters are coming in to hide out there.
That's true, and like even though this place is small, and even though like almost everyone there was a part of this heist. There were some sort of I don't know what regular Joes, like the guy who's like just likes to fish and is really terrible at poker or whatever, and
then and they're there with their wives. So it kind of reminded me. So it's interesting that in that case, Key Largo, the setting itself had became much more of a character in the film, whereas the events that happen in Kansas City kind of end up being a little bit, and we'll talk about this later. Is just it kind of ends up being like it is in Reservoir Dogs, where it's not really about the crime itself, but really the aftermath of it and how the characters involved deal with the consequences. So, I'm kind of torn because on the one hand, I get what the Kansas City Confidential is referring to, but it didn't quite feel like it fit.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's true. But I think, I kind of felt that way as well so, Brian, I get what you're saying, and I think that is a good way to sort of look at it. But just tying back to the James Ellroy thing real quick, I like the ending in particular with Mr. Big reminded me a lot of LA Confidential, and I had seen this movie before. I kind of forgotten some of these details, but Mr. Big dying and like the sort of truth of what Mr. Big was didn't come out, and how John Payne was looped into Mr. Big's lie, was very much like the Dudley Smith and Ed Exley story, how that was resolved in Confidential.
Right. And even the cops kind of breaking the rules with torturing essentially the protagonist to get information out of him is very
Force
much
of confession and all that.
Hiding out in Mexico, all that stuff. You could definitely see a direct influence on.
They call me Buzz.
Exactly, which is interesting because that theme of kind of humanizing the criminals and the cops kind of being shown to do criminal things comes back in City on Fire as well. So there's kind of a nice link there as well.
Yeah, that's true.
Should we move on to City on Fire? Do we have anything else we want to talk about with Kansas City Confidential?
I mean, if we want to do the connections to Reservoir Dogs now, I did have a couple of things to mention about this one.
Yeah, I had a couple of things as well, but
get to them now because you guys have them top of mind.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, a couple of things. Like, first of all, connection-wise, I think Kansas City Confidential maybe not as sort of directly influencing Reservoir Dogs as the next film, City on Fire, but there are certainly a lot of connections. Mr. Big knows all of the criminals. The criminals don't know each other. Mm-hmm. Anonymity is a big part of this thing. Mm-hmm. The aftermath of the crime is what the movie is all about.
Correct.
It's not about the crime itself.
Right.
Also, there is an undercover, cop, or in this case, kind of an ex-cop. The undercover role is kind of split. Joe is undercover, infiltrating the gang. Mr. Big used to be a cop and, is trying to get out of this situation by using his cop bona fides to turn in all the other criminals for the sort of insurance money. He won't get to keep his, $300,000, but he'll get to keep 25% of 1.2 million or whatever it was.
That was a reward, right?
Yeah, which will essentially be his same share.
Yeah, exactly. I was like doing the math. Wait a minute. He's going to get the same amount.
You can either have a quarter of this or 25%.
I think I'll do. And then at the very, very end, like the guy who is a criminal and also a cop gets gut shot. Which is Mr. Big there.
Very sad ending for Mr. Big, too, especially because we got to know him. We got to know his daughter, who became the love interest of our protagonist. a nice.
Colleen Gray, played this character. She was also the sort of the Sterling Hayden love interest in The Killing, which we were talking about a second ago. Just an interesting little minor connection.
Minor.
Although it could be a direct connection, since I believe Tarantino referenced The Killing as one of the influences for.
That's true. That's true.
For Reservoir.
Andy, you said you had something for Kansas City?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and this is echoing a little bit what Jeremy said and going off what I said earlier, which is that I think this film stands as more of like kind of a general influence for Reservoir Dogs, because it wasn't so much the specifics, but it was kind of the narrative approach, right? Like Jeremy mentioned, it's more about the aftermath of the crime, but in this one we see the crime. It's pretty brief and just kind of a part of the first act, and then we kind of move on, and the bulk of the movie is really just kind of seeing the aftermath and following the protagonist as he tries to clear his name. There's also a pretty interesting dynamic that was there, which I thought was kind of cool, where I felt like there was a little bit of a question as to whether or not he wanted to be cut in or just clear his name. I don't know if you guys follow that.
Kind of both.
I could see it, in let's say a remake or whatever. Maybe not the Reservoir Dogs remake, but in an actual like remake of this movie.
Are you talking about a remake of a movie that we're talking about?
Yeah.
Listen, we've never talked about this on the show. It's like remaking the movies we watch.
Yeah.
But like
that's my favorite thing to talk about.
Yeah. Well, Brian, get ready, buddy. The interesting part would be like to take this and like have the Joe character and like have that ambiguity of like maybe he does just want to be cut in for his troubles of like being tortured by the cops and being the patsy.
I mean, he ends up getting the money, which is an interesting turn of events.
Right, exactly.
But I will say he ends up getting the money in a very Ellroyian manner, which is that kind of ironically, right? Because he ends up kind of being labeled as the hero, whereas this was kind of all orchestrated by Mr. Big, and it ends up kind of exonerating Mr. Big in the public eye, I guess, and because no one really finds out what actually happened.
Because his dying words were don't tell it, don't tell my daughter, don't tell her. Yeah,
exactly, or at least it protects his actions from being revealed to his daughter. So that was actually very, very interesting to see, and kind of again seeing the kind of link between this movie and something like LA Confidential. But going back to this idea of the link to Reservoir Dogs, I think the anonymity, the criminals interacting with each other and having to trust each other while not knowing each other, having to rely on each other while not being able to trust each other, I think is something that is essentially very pervasive throughout all of Reservoir Dogs, right? In fact, that's like what all the tension lies on, which is everybody, they have to band together to kind of figure out how to survive the aftermath of this heist gone wrong. But they don't really know who they don't know who they are. They don't know if they can trust each other. And really it all kind of blows up in the face when Tim Roth tries to sell Chris Penn a story that he can't believe because he actually knew Vic Vega. So that I thought that was pretty fascinating. And that actually happens in Kansas City Confidential, right? When Joe tries to pass as Pete Harris, and then it turns out that one of the criminals had done time with Pete Harris.
Boyd? Yeah, that guy.
Right. So those kind of parallels are there as well.
I did a nickel with him.
Yeah.
I know Pete Harris.
Yeah. Now that you mention that, isn't it interesting that Joe got away slapping people around, and when he got beat up, he just got totally messed up. He got like punched around and beaten by Lee Van Cleef. Like, it's the same with the cops. It's interesting how they amped up the violence when it came to him taking a beating.
I want to bring up the police again. Like, none of these films, and like we all agree on that, right? They didn't make police look very good. They didn't put them in the most positive light. In this one, Joe gets interrogated to a point where he's basically beat to hell. In City on Fire, we've got Chow, who's basically forced to be undercover against his will over and over again. Just, I guess it's to help out his uncle, really, to help his uncle contend with this young police cop or chief that's coming up through the ranks or something. But Yeah, it just didn't make. And then obviously Reservoir Dogs. They don't even call them real people in Reservoir Dogs. They said, did you kill anybody? No, just cops.
Yeah.
Oh, no real people. Good. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's definite common themes. Just kind of piggybacking on the themes between the three of these.
Yeah. Even though City on Fire, follows a lot of internal workings of the cops, which is different than Kansas City and Reservoir Dogs for sure. Mm-hmm. The movie still has that perspective that the bureaucracy sucks, and everybody in it is sort of corrupt and shitty, and
another torture scene. We get another torture scene in the middle of the police precinct.
They don't have the public's best interest in mind, and the cops are sitting there torturing. As it turns out, not a criminal, undercover cop. It's a fellow cop.
I kept going like this when I'm watching it. I'm like,
shit out of him.
Yeah, cutting his wrists.
When they slammed his head on the ground, that was so intense. I was asking Jeremy, how did they shoot that? Did they shoot that in slow motion and speed it up? Because he just takes a hit to the ground. That was pretty intense.
Should we move on to City on Fire?
Let's do it.
We were talking about some of the violence in Kansas City Confidential. In City on Fire, it is up to the Hong Kong action film crime thriller level of bloody violence. We're not talking 3M stage blood here, folks.
Yeah.
We're talking the good red goopy shit. Yeah, the real blood
from the opening scene, right?
Holy shit! Yeah, this movie's great. This is definitely one of my types of movies by far. This is Chow Yun-fat, who was in probably 38 films in this year alone. I think in 1987, he was in everything.
Well, it's so Chow Yun-fat in this movie, maybe while they were shooting it, he wasn't there yet. But by the time this movie came out, he was already a huge, huge, huge star in Asia because the year before, A Better Tomorrow came out. And that movie, really blew up. And, the way that movie works, it doesn't end in a way where you're like, okay, this makes sense to have a sequel. But they definitely had a sequel, and that they kind of did the soap opera thing of having a twin brother come up and oh yeah, Chow Yun-fat, well, we'll get you back in here. But it's it was so popular that they had to do that. And, this movie, at least I'm sure for the Asian market, was a bigger movie. And certainly because the star of it, Chow Yun-fat, was a huge star in the year's previous movie. This movie, City on Fire, was absolutely super obscure. Even something like 95, when there were rumblings of maybe not everything in Reservoir Dogs was springing forth from the imagination of Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah.
Even then, it was extremely hard to find this movie.
Right.
And, that there were even articles from the time, talking about how, there's an obscure Chinese movie that no one knows in the States, but the third act is pretty similar, let's say.
Didn't the director come after Tarantino for that? Or because he was also the screenwriter, I think, too.
Oh, really? Yeah, I wasn't sure about that part. Did you look that up?
I think I saw just, skimming through some articles about it, but yeah, there was definitely some controversy on that. And if you see, there's some shots that are ripped right from it. So I mean, there's a lot, but it does kind of feel like the Tim Roth character. Chow's character does feel like Mr. Orange to me. Yeah. He's obviously in too deep right now as an undercover, and he is so far in now. He's either gonna die or he's gonna probably just become one of them. I don't even know how that works out. Kind of like Donnie Brasco, you get kind of locked in.
Yeah.
But this was a really kind of a tough movie. I mean, there were some weird moments, and don't get me wrong. There's always these weird goofball moments.
Yeah.
He's
right. The guy in the very beginning who was ostensibly killed for snitching, but really was just killed for that terrible ponytail he had.
He gets it bad though. That's the stabbing, right? Right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Oh man,
at the very beginning.
But he was an undercover cop too, right? That. That was kind of the foreshadowing that, you're an undercover cop. They're gonna find you out.
They're gonna 187 that undercover cop exactly. And then that sheet comes down and you just get that psycho, the handprints and
it's awesome.
Yeah.
You could actually see influences of that in Reservoir Dogs, because one of the things that always stands out to me is the use of blood in Reservoir Dogs, and primarily on the kind of wide upholstery of the opening scene where we see or one of the early scenes where we see Tim Roth in the back bleeding all over the seat. Just the kind of pool of blood against the like white shirts.
It becomes a clock too. The
Right.
amount of blood by the end.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly.
Larry.
But I felt a little bit of that tone being set as well in City on Fire very early on, where you saw that the violence is kind of that raw and visceral to begin with.
Oh yeah.
Especially if you think about it as like an assassination by knife, and where one of the plot points becomes how hard it is to get guns, which is kind of
Right.
an
Yeah,
interesting.
That's a great point.
An interesting thought, because you rarely associate.
Right.
You really think that in a crime film the criminals would have a hard time finding guns, right?
Right. Well, that's part of that. It's the American perspective as well, right?
Right,
Just
exactly.
the accessibility of all this stuff.
So it was almost like the crimes kind of compounded on themselves with this gang of criminals, right? Because they were using the guns for a crime, but to get those guns, they also had to commit crimes to get the guns illegally. So it was kind of like just this.
Exactly. And they were excited to get revolvers, and meanwhile the cops come in at the end with like full-on rifles and
The M16s and
tactical gear. I don't think they stood a chance, really.
You mean corrugated tin wasn't going to hold back the armor-piercing rounds of the cops?
Well, I guess those are the special units, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, the violence early on, I think, was kind of something that stood out as an influence as well. So I felt like that really set the tone for the rest of the film.
Yeah, I agree. And it didn't stop either. But also a very fast-moving film. It felt almost documentary-esque in terms of the way it was shot and portrayed. A lot of really cool shots. I guess that's downtown Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I mean, I just, never been there, don't know. But the lights and the like the neon and things like that they just portrayed, they really, again, we talk about, the locations of these movies being characters themselves. This felt like that was all part of it. That grit and that city life was very much part of the vibe of this movie.
The downtown Diamond District area.
Yeah.
The huge Recoleta on steroids, that giant cemetery.
Right.
Beautiful
area.
Jesus. Yeah.
All that stuff, like the little apartment with bunk beds that they were hanging out in. I mean, all that stuff, like really, like became a character.
Yeah.
Chow Yun-fat's apartment, or his girlfriend's apartment, or whoever that was.
Yeah.
There's so much where you feel like you're maybe documentary like, where you're seeing footage in intimate moments, or places where you normally wouldn't be, but it's a fly on the wall type of feeling, but not like sort of removed, but there is this weird sense of like voyeurism, and I think that intangible quality of the sort of blending the sort of art and what it feels like to actually be in a place. I think Tarantino nailed so well in Reservoir Dogs as well. It's like we'll get to some of that later, but that quality was also there in Dogs. That was in City on Fire as well, where it's like you feel the area and the place and the sights and sounds of where you are.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right that Tarantino shows very little of the kind of world outside of the warehouse, but in a way, LA becomes a character, and that's something that in City on Fire, Ringo Lam achieves as well. If you think about, for example, that great set piece where he's running away from the cops after picking up the kind of bag in the locker at the bowling alley. It's interesting because I was really reminded of Steve Buscemi running away from the cops.
Absolutely,
in Reservoir Dogs, and also Tim Roth, like his story of having the weed in the train station.
In the bag.
It's kind of like a combination of both, right? Because he's kind of carrying this like small satchel trying to run away from the cops. And then there's this like huge tracking shot of him like running full speed, across Hong Kong there, the streets, the busy streets of Hong Kong. And that similar scene, or there was a very similar scene in Reservoir Dogs when he's like running away from the police after he's actually stolen the diamonds.
Mm-hmm. And then he fires a chamber or a magazine of, I think, 38 bullets at the cops at that one point. Over the car, he just keeps firing.
Both hands full. That was wild. It's funny. There was some other stuff in here where it was like, so there were two jewelry store heists or jewelry heists. Like one was in kind of a jewelry warehouse where they were cutting the diamonds, and then another one was like an actual storefront at the end. But the one where they were at the wholesaler, let's say, where they're like beating the shit out of the manager, stab him in the hand and whatever. Like, boy, oh boy, was that...
Wasn't that kind of Harvey Keitel?
Exactly, yeah.
The manager. He wants to talk shit to you.
Rip
his finger off.
A real cowboy? You gotta...
Rip his finger off. Tell him his thumb's next.
Yeah. Then he'll tell you
talk shit to you. Give her a look like you're going to do it next.
Yeah.
Man,
exactly.
That's exactly what I thought. And I thought he was going to rip off his finger in that. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's where he got that idea. But he just stabbed his hand into the table, right? Or the counter.
Yeah,
that was great.
You were kind of just waiting to see if they would go get tacos afterwards, right?
Yeah.
I got to get a taco. That's my favorite line.
I'm hungry. Let's get a taco.
What's funny is like a guy from Milwaukee who pronounces taco that way.
Yeah.
The Bronx, Milwaukee.
That's
you've
true.
heard of it.
I never thought.
Taco.
It's interesting that he is supposed to. It is interesting that he's supposed to be from Milwaukee, right? Because I'm not sure if he had the accent right there, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the similarity category here, obviously, we've got Tiger, or his name was Fu, but they called him Tiger. Danny Lee's character kind of played the Harvey Keitel, Mr. White, bringing Chow as like the new criminal under his wing. He was kind of he was sticking up for him, he was vouching for him, even though in this instance the Mr. Big character, who was very similar to all the Mr. Bigs in all these movies, the boss of the gang. He had his doubts. He had his doubts about bringing this new guy on, and it very much was like Joe at the end realizing that he shouldn't have let Mr. Orange onto this job because he had his doubts from the get-go. And the same thing in City on Fire. This boss also had his doubts, and and everybody goes out in a blaze in this one, but a little bit different. There's even a standoff, just like Reservoir Dogs at the end. Obviously, it ends a little bit different. And then we also get the man in the other man's arms, similar to the end of Reservoir Dogs with orange and white. But again, Reservoir Dogs ends a little bit more dark and sinister, I guess.
It's really that last, whatever it is, 20 minutes of City on Fire, where you're like, okay, I'm seeing certain things that are similar, but it's like, oh wait, there it is. The last 20 minutes, it's like, full on
the windshield shooting, that was straight. I mean, like shot for shot.
The going back to the diamond heist, they're robbing a jewelry store.
If they hadn't done what I told them not to do, they'd still be alive.
But in this one, they showed it. In this one, we see the two girls behind the counter get wasted. They don't just get shot in this movie. They become Swiss
They make a
cheese.
big deal about how bullets and guns are rare and hard to find, and
and he just
unloads.
Yosemite Samming in there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, but there were some violent scenes against women in that scene, man. I was like, holy shit, they just blew them away. I mean, giant bullet holes with blood flying out of them.
And also, the entire movie, it felt like a Shane Black movie where it was like, there's Christmas everywhere, there's Lethal Weapon music on the soundtrack the whole time, and it's like the really soft, blasting jazz. And then when we get to the robbery, it turns into sort of like Thief, and like that rock synth Tangerine Dream sound during that sort of last robbery, which was really cool. I mean, the music. I mean, that robbery was like, okay, that's the right music, and then everywhere else in the movie, you're like, maybe not so much. Especially at the very, very, very end freeze frame.
Yeah, I know. Of him just
where it's like
dancing.
The guy playing the sax in fucking Lost Boys.
Yeah,
I still believe.
The guy with the codpiece, that guy's the best. Yeah. I know I keep doing visual jokes on the podcast. Yeah. It's not working.
Well, good work, buddy.
It's funny because the tone of the film, didn't really work when it was that light, but it worked really well during the set pieces when it turned a little bit more intense and like they cranked up the tension there. But it is interesting that they would just like go away from that, and unfortunately it took you out a little bit out of the movie a little bit.
There were quite a few moments like that took me out. I mean, like some of the romance that they tried to portray didn't sell for me. I thought that his love interest was just kind of, she was never there and she was always leaving, and this guy was like, I gotta go to work, and like she just wasn't understanding, and she ended up with that other nerd, whoever the hell that guy was. Right. But I was just like,
her sugar daddy guy. Yeah, it's like
to fly her to Toronto or Canada, wherever they were going.
But that one, it was like, did they go to Hawaii? Did they go to Canada? It's like they kept kind of
because he got the telegram from the U.S., but they went to Canada, right? Yeah.
USA.
USA, yeah.
But what was interesting was that love story, as sort of frustrating as it was, perhaps because it was so frustrating, from his perspective, and like, he's like, okay, I'm out of here, and the cops like beat the shit out of him, and he's like, fuck this, I'm done with this, I'm gonna go, try to repair my relationship, and then his uncle's like, off screen, I guess, convinces him to come back into the fold. And then, he sees her leave, and, he gets the letter later on and has that bonding moment with Danny Lee's character, Tiger. And all of that, really helped sell the audience on caring for Chow Yun-fat, caring for the relationship between Danny Lee and Chow. And then it also, I think, Andy, we were talking about this earlier. It's like, it also like set up this idea that after the heist and after like, the Mexican standoff and all this, that, there's something for Chow to look forward to. He can go try to repair his relationship with this woman, and like, it gave the audience an expectation that there's some sort of future for him. Right. Whereas like, certainly with Mr. Orange in fucking Reservoir Dogs, like there's absolutely no future. That guy's dead.
Right.
Right.
It's interesting because I think that's where watching these two movies and seeing, especially like in the last 20-30 minutes of the third act, how many similarities there are, it's actually more interesting to notice the differences, right? And what that comes down to is kind of perspective, because I feel like, although you could debate that, Reservoir Dogs adopts the perspective of Mr. Orange, I actually think it's more about Harvey Keitel and what was...
Mr. White.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like in City on Fire, what was interesting is that they did spend a lot of time investing in this relationship, and even though those scenes didn't ultimately work because the tone didn't match the rest of the film, what it did do is really set up who Chow Yun-fat's character was. It made you kind of root for him. It made you understand what he wanted, which is basically came down to two things. One is he wanted to stop being an undercover cop and marry the woman he loved. And so the whole time it kind of gave you something to root for, to want the protagonist to achieve, and you had all these elements standing in his way, so that at the very end, when obviously he doesn't go rescue his love from Hawaii, that tragedy, really hits home, and it gives the film a kind of catharsis that that kind of resonates with you after the film's over. In Reservoir Dogs, it's interesting because you do feel the tragedy. I mean, you feel bad at the very end, but you kind of feel bad for Harvey Keitel. And part of that is you weren't as invested in Tim Roth. And so it's interesting that some of the choices made in that movie had a whole different effect.
Well, it's because I think part of it is because you only experienced Tim Roth's point of view in the context of his job as an undercover cop. Like, you don't know anything about him personally. You don't have that level of investment the way that you had with Chow Yun-fat's character.
But there is the wedding ring thing that the little hint.
Yeah, it's interesting. That is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they hint at it. Yeah, okay, the wedding ring, but like, with Chow Yun-fat character, you had this like investment. You saw how he was around this woman and what she meant to him, and the effect that her leaving him had on him. And so, you as the audience are getting more invested in him in that way.
Yeah, but for example, you didn't really know what Tim Roth was going to get out of all this. Presumably, it's advancing his career.
A promotion.
But it wasn't as like the motivation and like, let's just say this, the stakes for Tim Roth were not as high as the stakes were for Chow Yun-fat, because Chow Yun-fat, like, one, was coerced into doing what he was doing, and two, that kind of went against what he actually wanted to do, was just kind of carry on his normal life and marry.
I mean,
marry this
Mr.
girl.
Orange, he wanted to do that. That was his choice to.
There's an element of that. But what's also interesting, it's also little things. For example, it's interesting to see the difference between showing and not showing the heist, right? Chow Yun-fat witnesses a lot of innocent people being murdered and also participates in it. Tim Roth, we don't see him witnessing the bystanders getting shot during the heist. We do
like
see
the Mr.
him,
Blonde executions.
right?
Yeah.
Which it's interesting because in one hand it makes it seem more heinous than maybe you could have just like shown it, because in your mind you're kind of thinking that you're kind of just listening to how they're describing it as this just like
Was that girl 19, 20?
yeah, just this super violent, heinous kind of execution style rampage that Mr. Blonde goes into all of a sudden. But on the other hand, we don't see Tim Roth's reaction to it, which I think is important in kind of understanding kind of his arc and his tragic arc, if the point of the film is his perspective.
We don't see his initial reaction to it. And I know we're jumping ahead to Reservoir Dogs, but we don't see Tim Roth's initial reaction to the executions in the bank, but we do see him walking with Mr. White to the car right before he gets killed. And he's clearly like just seen a lot. You can tell that he's just like, holy shit, this did not go right. Like, this is not.
Yeah, and he's watching Mr. White, blow away the cops with his,
in the city on fire shot,
in
right?
the exact city on fire thing, and
right,
and
his
reaction
expression while he sees that, you're feeling that.
But then he takes out a civilian.
Yeah,
which also exactly happens in City on Fire,
right?
Where he gets gut shot, blows away the person who shot him, and then has that same sort of push in on it on his face for the reaction of like, oh my god, what have I just done?
Right.
But it's like, you do get a little bit of that with the Tim Roth character in Reservoir Dogs, with those sort of two shots in particular. And, the whole time, he's begging to stay alive, and, so you're kind of feeling bad for him there. And he saved the, or temporarily anyway, the cop being tortured.
Yeah.
And you've got things to invest with in a way. But, it is interesting as a point of contrast to see City on Fire versus Reservoir Dogs and how they treat that exact same character. And how they give you something more to chew on with Chow Yun-fat. Yeah.
And Chow Yun-fat, for example, there's just a little moment where it's when the woman that sets off the alarm gets blown away, he actually goes to her and in a way kind of blows his cover a little bit, because what is he doing? Like, everybody else is worried about the cops and getting out of there, and he's the only one that goes there. So it's a little thing. It probably wouldn't have worked for Reservoir Dogs because there was an element of kind of what's not being shown or what's happening off screen kind of being heightened in your mind. If you think about the use of sound design, the fact that you never see the cops kind of coming in and ambushing Tim Roth and Harvey Keitel or blowing them away, you don't see that. Your mind kind of fills the blanks. So there is a nice...
and he blows away Tim Roth too, right? I mean, so there's we don't see that moment where... Because Keitel says it in he says, I must have a stroke of bad luck, or he says something like, I must be unlucky. I must be
jinxed.
I must be fucking jinxed. That's what he said. And he's like, a couple jobs back, it was a 2-man job, and one of them ended up being an undercover cop, and that was like exactly what this one was. So I in many ways agree. I think this is Mr. White's story as much as it is Mr. Orange. I think they're very much in parallel. We actually find out more about Mr. White before we find out about Mr. Orange in the way that the movies, that obviously for the right reasons, you got to set up the cop later on in the movie. but I feel like we were following him from the beginning, Mr. White.
And you know more background. I mean, you know what he was doing before he got brought into this. We kind of don't know what Tim Roth was up to.
And he's my favorite part of the diner scene at the beginning. You know, Toby,
exactly.
Toby Chu, Toby Wong, fucking Charlie Chan. Madonna's big dick coming I left here. He was great in that.
Yeah, but I wonder if this is something we should talk about on City on Fire or do it as a contrast with Reservoir Dogs. But like, it is really interesting to have the contrast to that last moment that you were just referencing, where it's like in City on Fire, it makes a lot more sense why Chow Yun-fat confesses it and wants him to do it than it does in Reservoir Dogs, where it kind of, if he just holds his mouth shut for like 30 seconds more, perhaps he could have gotten away with it.
And Harvey Keitel would be alive because he was already just planning on turning himself in. He's like, I mean, there's that line that I always forget about where he's like, looks like we're going to be doing a long stretch now.
Yeah, he whispers that to him. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just caught that the first time watching it this time.
Yeah. And you're right. Like, it made me question this time, why does Tim Roth confess? Now, I guess you could make the argument that Tim Roth felt like he was dying anyway and he wanted to get it off his chest, but...
did he owe it to Mr. White? Because Mr. White kind of stuck out for him.
But here's the big difference. It goes back to the fact that it made a lot more sense why the Tiger character was sticking up for the Chow character, because Chow Yun-fat saves the Tiger character in the middle of the shootout. Whereas I think you pointed this out, Jeremy. Even though Harvey Keitel mentions that it's his fault that Tim Roth got shot, we don't really see that on screen. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily his fault. So that element
he takes the blame.
That Mr. Orange was shot. Perhaps Mr. White felt guilty about it, but it wasn't something specific that he did or didn't do that like sort of earned that guilt the way that Chow's loyalty was earned by Tiger because Chow saved Tiger's life.
Right, so that makes him sticking up for it during the standoff make a lot more sense. And then
he also had that dream where he was feeling guilty about what's going to happen to Chow.
Twice, right? That happened twice in the film. Earlier on, and then again towards the end, right?
Well, because, at the end he sees...
That was going to happen to Tiger.
I'm sorry. Chow is dreaming that Tiger is dead in the police station with a bullet in his head, and he's like, he's kind of hearing that voiceover and whatever. And so that's like Tiger sort of feeling guilty for what he was doing, and then on top of that, that at the end there, he wants to sort of have him kill him so he can get away, and and give him time to get out of there.
That seems like a lot more understandable reason why he reveals himself at the end, which is that he's trying to help Tiger get away by not letting Tiger, being held back by trying to save Chow Yun-fat. So and he possibly also knew that he was dying as well. So the kind of the tragedy there just in a way works so much better just because you really do feel like Chow Yun-fat owed it to him, right? And so there's this great moment between them that I actually think that it reminds me a lot of Heat, and I wonder if Michael Mann saw this film too, because you have the cop and the criminal kind of forming this bond, and that bond kind of being torn apart by the two lines of the law on which each one lie, and so it created this really great moment in the film that I thought kind of was worth kind of the more awkward moments of levity throughout the film. That moment of tragedy was really great at the end. I felt like we didn't get that because in Reservoir Dogs, the movie kind of just ends when you're about to get that, right? And so it's a little bit more of a kind of punch in the gut at the very end as the movie kind of just comes to that kind of explosive conclusion.
You mean so we don't see like what happens in the aftermath? It's just kind of cuts to black. Is that instead of like hanging on Chow and seeing him dead, and then the uncle like crying over him and like
right.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, I think Tarantino and Sally Menke, his editor, they cut out of stuff really quick in that. It's very punchy throughout the entire movie. It's one of those things that kind of establishes itself as being punchy right off the bat. You've got that long drawn out diner scene, and then some argument about or discussion about Madonna, and then not tipping, and then
yeah.
all of a sudden you're in the back of the car covered in blood with Mr. Orange screaming, and you're like, where the fuck did this happen, and how did this happen? So it's
Right.
like, it really gets to it. I think a lot of the stuff, although he did pull it from these other films, I do think that it worked for his own story too, and he didn't just put things in there for the sake of saying, hey, I'm going to do the same scene that was in this other film that I thought was awesome. It actually worked for this one, and I thought it was great how he wrote those things in. Specifically that scene with Orange and White when White takes out that car of the cop car with the windshield, when he just pops the windshield and that blood just spurts out and those guys fall out. I was like, damn, it was exactly the same thing in City on Fire, but I mean, it worked. It was part of the story. It was just the same thing that White was talking to Pink about. He was like, did you'd get out of there? Yeah, I'd take out a few cops to get out of there, and punched a hole out. And that was, I found a hole, or you found a hole. We all found holes out of there, and that was how he had to make it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really cool because I hadn't seen the Reservoir Dogs in a long time, and
me too. It's been like 10 years at least.
Right, and some of the the iconic kind of visuals and the plot points, you remember. But what was really cool watching it again after watching these other two films, which I watched first, was just how great the acting is. Like that, it really is a movie that kind of holds on and kind of depends on the kind of tour de force of these actors and their performances.
Because they're just playing in a theater, right? Or on stage in many ways. It's just one stage or theater type setup.
Well, it is, although this goes to my second point, which I'm also reminded just how great the cinema is of the movie. Like the blocking, how the film's shot, the cinematography is actually pretty beautiful. The use of
great.
The use of the motif of the radio station and all the great music, and that it's not just in there for the purpose of being in there, but it kind of plays as a kind of nice transition from scene to scene. At one point, it takes us from the interior of a police car into the interior of the criminal's car, and it just there are a lot of great.
Can you hand me that bear claw?
Yeah, I know. But there's the coverage, and there's just a lot of great kind of visual, cinematic kind of storytelling elements that you kind of forget about because you just kind of remember as this being kind of a contained story, which is these criminals kind of debating what to do in the aftermath of this crime. But Tarantino kind of really shows his directorial prowess and how great of a filmmaker he is in just how the film is shot, right? So even though, there's a lot of story elements that are very similar to City on Fire, he brings his own style, and it kind of reminds you why the film is so great for what it is, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to second the acting. It was incredible watching it this latest time, really getting into, especially Buscemi. I think he steals this movie.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he and Michael Madsen, I think, really, bring home the bacon on this one. Lawrence Tierney too, but it's because he's kind of has a smaller part, and
the motherfucker is the thing.
What, like that invisible bitch and shit?
Flame on.
Yeah, Michael Madsen. Yeah, it's funny because you think about it. Like at the time when the movie came out, you really felt like this was really going to propel everyone's careers, and Steve Buscemi obviously did. But I was kind of asking Jeremy, like, I was trying to think of like what other films Michael Madsen did after this.
Species.
That's right.
Yeah,
he was in a bunch actually. I mean, he had a good career.
Yeah, but it seemed like he was going to get a lot more starring roles after this type of thing.
Because he had such great presence in this movie, right? And in a small role.
In many ways, I mean, he is kind of the fulcrum character of everything. You've got White and Orange. Actually, White on many ways it's on one side. You've got Pink that's kind of like floating around, but Blonde is like the problem, and it's like he's the one that throws everything off balance because White's pissed off because he didn't realize that Joe was going to put some psychopath in the same room as him. So there's all that conflict there. They didn't know that the guy was a psychopath, and everyone else acts like they say, a fucking professional, but he doesn't act like a professional. He's just a madman,
Yeah.
So he was that like wild card that, what they thought kind of screwed up the bank heist. However, it was all planned by the cops to.
Yeah.
Well, it did screw it up in the sense that, like, yeah, they would have walked out of there, and then the cops would have arrested everybody. Maybe, or maybe there would have been a giant shootout, and who knows?
Right.
But yeah, like the cops stormed in because of the executions by Mr. Blonde.
Right. Because they were going to wait for them to leave, then arrest them, but there was can't wait when he's bam, bam, bam.
Yeah, in a way, your mind makes that, I'm sure, seem kind of just worse and more violent than it was. So that
I did especially this time. Like, I was like putting this bloody mess together. Him like holding guns to people's heads and just execution style. Like, that's scary shit.
And if you think of Mr. Blonde's introduction, like the way he's introduced on film is just so cinematic, right? And so even though you think of the story being contained like a play, Quentin Tarantino really just exploits the power of cinema in this kind of contained story. Mm-hmm. And even with the little that the camera goes outside of the warehouse, it actually makes the world seem a lot bigger in a way that if you think about it, it really makes LA in that time period a character in the film, right? I mean, he just chooses these locations that are kind of very iconic of LA in a way. Even if you think about that rooftop scene where he's practicing the story, and you see
probably Hollywood or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I had to mention in Joe's office behind him, there's a severed elephant foot on a table in the back, and it just holy
there's obviously those huge tusks, but then Jesus, that elephant foot is so
this guy is a complete bastard, right? Like, he's like the worst person ever.
But how much did Joe also remind you of Mr. Big? You know, especially when he's like
the look too.
You're Mr. Blonde, you're Mr. Pink,
the voice,
and that whole thing, and then he's talking about it like it's like a caper and whatever, and he's like
caper,
yelling at the guys and the
notes on the board. It was like the same.
Yeah. Oh. And that too. So like the map was a big deal in Kansas City Confidential. The map was also a big deal in City on Fire. And it was very similar schematic. And it's like, oh, here, come in here, go do this, go there.
But then they just had it up in the background in Reservoir Dogs. They didn't get into. That's what I think was really cool about Reservoir Dogs, especially watching these films together, was all the specifics of all the crimes in City on Fire and in Kansas City Confidential.
Yeah.
They showed you the crimes. They showed you what they did, and it was step by step. In Reservoir Dogs, he didn't get into any specifics.
Right. He cut all of that out. It was all before and all after.
And it was like a bunch of stones. There was really no value. They asked him, well, what's the cut? Juicy, Junior. Real juicy. But they didn't give any dollar amounts. Nothing is because it doesn't matter. It's more about characters that are dealing with the aftermath of one of the craziest fuck-ups ever.
Yeah.
There is another similarity there that I was just thinking about, which is there's a really cool scene in City on Fire where Chow Yun-fat shows up for a meeting where they're supposed to go over and finally find out what store they're going to heist. Mm-hmm. And then as it turns out, everybody's got to turn in their beepers. And then, and then they'd be forced to kind of all live there until the heist was executed. And I thought,
in their bunk beds,
which is a nice kind of story element where it kind of forced him to kind of spend time with the Tiger character, and it kind of although you maybe needed more of this, it helped sell the bond between them a little bit more. You maybe needed a little bit more, but at least they did that, and it also produced this tension because he couldn't exactly get out all the information that he needed to. But with Tarantino, he also achieves that with having the opening diner scene, and I thought that was pretty interesting because it shows that they had spent some time together and that they had all built this rapport. Unlike in Kansas City Confidential, where they literally just kind of come together for the heist itself, there's this idea of these strangers, anonymous strangers who don't know each other, kind of having to interact and get along with each other, even though they don't necessarily trust each other. There is an element of getting to know each other, and so I do see that parallel between the two films.
I think that's also the theme of The Real World. 7 strangers picked to live in a house.
Exactly.
And stop being polite and start getting real.
7 thieves forced together to live in a house.
What's funny, I've been looking at some things for City on Fire online, and there's a poster with the font. It says City on Fire. It's Tiger and Chow, and they're both on the bottom right of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big blood splatter, and I've seen the exact same Reservoir Dogs poster, but with the 4 or 5 criminals, whatever that is, and then the same exact thing. So there must just be something out there that people are like, well, it is what it is, kind of thing.
Yeah,
but
I guess if you do, you just got to make sure that your movie ends up being more iconic and more successful,
and available more.
Right.
And more available.
Just like Star Wars, Reservoir Dogs has to be, like rip off an obscure movie and then make sure your movie becomes super iconic and becomes like a whole part of pop culture, and then you can take from whatever you want.
Yeah, it's like Tom Cruise in A Few Good Men, right? You either go all the way and get the general to confess, or you're gonna get court-martialed and sued.
That's your proof? You don't need proof when you have instinct.
Well, I guess we can probably wrap it up if you guys wanted to do any closing thoughts.
Sure. I think the thing that we talk about, Tarantino, borrowing from a lot of places and, a lot of pastiche, a lot of, influences and homages and all these things. But the thing that he ripped off the most, I think, was Vic Vega's name. He stole that straight from Street Fighter. That's bullshit.
Well, what's kind of cool this time, I noticed that his nickname was great. It was Toothpick Vic. It was
Toothpick Vic, yeah. I see you sitting there, but I don't believe it.
Yeah.
I really appreciated his backstory in this time more.
Yeah,
you forget.
I agree.
He's such a kind of catalyst and foil for the story itself that, and he's kind of a very kind of distant and portrayed psychopathically in the story itself, that it was really cool to listen to his backstory. And
because he's family friends with Joe and them, like he's had to have known them since they were kids. That's what I feel.
Yeah, and you know what? It really reminded me of like a Michael Mann character, right? Like it felt like Michael Mann would have had a similar backstory in one of his films, right? This guy that feels loyalty towards kind of like Robert De Niro.
This is like a humanized version of Waingro.
Exactly.
Mr. Blonde had to get it on, man. He had to get it on. He was making a move.
Exactly. It was a really cool backstory that I really enjoyed watching this time around.
Yeah, it was good to see Chris Penn and him because clearly they knew each other. I liked that he wasn't going to be originally. I forgot all about this. He wasn't originally going to be on the job, and then Chris Penn, or this. Fast Guy Eddie.
Right.
He basically says,
Nice guy,
I got an idea, he's been nothing but a good luck charm for us, so we might as well put him on this job. And he ends up being the one that starts blowing people away,
Right.
It's just really, really interesting how they set all that stuff up because they clearly knew each other for their whole lives. And that's why they put him on this job.
But that backstory is great because it actually pays off, right? It's the thing that makes Chris Penn essentially figure out that and really believe that Tim Roth is lying, right? So it kind of paid off. Whereas
does he see that though?
Yeah, he's like, you think that this guy who spent 5 years, my dad,
He's just gonna decide out of the fucking blue to rip us off?
Yeah, and he's like spitting.
But it builds tension because you see that coming, right? You kind of see it coming because you're like, oh, it's going to be hard for him to sell him on this notion. And that backstory, it's cool to get to kind of when you're watching it, but it also pays off. Whereas, you don't see Mr. Brown's backstory or you don't see Mr. Blue's backstory.
Yeah.
You don't even see Mr. Pink's backstory. So in that sense, like, again, there's, kind of all these great cinematic elements that kind of make the scope of the film larger than it is. And you really have to give Tarantino credit for that.
I didn't even think about that. They didn't even give Pink a backstory, but in many ways, I think that his performance in the movie, he was just as important as everyone else. Like, that's how good Steve Buscemi was in that role as Mr. Pink. Like,
right. I mean, and you could say that about a lot of his great roles in his career, right? Where it's like, they may not be very big, but he has a huge impact on the film, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he got leading man status until Boardwalk Empire. I mean, I don't think he was like a...
Yeah, I think that's... You're probably right.
Yeah, but Steve Buscemi, it was awesome seeing him. And like you said, the acting in that, it's incredible. But what's that? You have one more thing? Sorry.
So, real quick, one other thing was that, like, just to piggyback off of what Andy was saying there about, how the city kind of became a character. Like, I think, the movie is mostly remembered for, like the sort of rock and roll soundtrack and, the sort of really overt, more cinematic things that he does. But I think some of the most successful cinematic things that he achieved in this were things like making the city a character, particularly sort of my favorite scene, which is like in the middle of the torturing the cop scene. He walks outside. We're just kind of following him the whole time. And then we hear the music's totally gone. We hear the sounds of the street and, someone's hammering nearby and, birds or whatever. And he pops up in the trunk and grabs the gasoline. And you get this sense of this whole world that's around there. And it's just like this like very simple little thing that's like, okay, yeah, maybe you didn't need to have that in there, but like it opens everything up so much and it feels so real. It feels like that almost documentary thing.
Right.
So that when you have more sensational things and everything else, it makes it, feel more grounded because you're able to sort of achieve that really sort of grounding moment. And we kind of talked about that a little bit in City on Fire, how like certain moments felt like you were just kind of observing, you're kind of a fly on the wall. But that one in particular in this movie really, really always kind of like amazed me, and it still like holds that power, even watching it, sixth, seventh time or whatever this was this time.
Plus, when you start hearing random people in the background and cars and stuff, you're and this shit is going on here in this warehouse. A cop's getting his ear cut off right now,
right.
And I'm just driving by.
Put the radio on. I mean,
ooh, Steelers wheel.
Yeah.
It was pretty soundproof when he walked out, right?
I do love the use, and he did this in a lot of his early movies. Was that I think they call it diegetic sound, where,
right?
Yep.
The radio is playing the soundtrack. Mm-hmm. And that one in particular had reminded me of The Thing. There's a scene in The Thing when the same kind of thing happens when Windows, is that his name, on the roller skates, when he moves from one room to the other, and there's like this sound that kind of carries away as he's moving toward the camera.
Oh, right, because he's
back.
listening on headphones and you can kind of hear it slightly. Yeah, totally. And that puts you in that world, like as the audience, like so much that like...
Oh, yeah. It's tangible.
Yeah, it feels like such a little thing, but like, man, it has such a strong impact on the rest of the movie. And like you're saying, like there's all these other like beautiful things about that one particular moment where he walks out and grabs the gas can and comes back. Is it like, like you go outside, it's just a total normal day. People are going about their business, whatever. So it kind of gives you this scary sense that like anything this crazy could be happening behind any of those doors nearby.
Next door.
Yeah. All kinds of stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's starting to look like Sam's Hot Car Lot out here.
Yeah, the dialogue was pretty great. Like some of the banter back and forth, especially Buscemi, is really awesome. I think one final note that I thought was really interesting was that it was really great watching this series of films, because although I do think it opens up this debate and begs this question of what's kind of the difference between influence and homage and ripoff. One of the things you can really appreciate is that kind of wherever you fall on that, at least Quentin Tarantino referenced some really great films that really make you interested in watching more of those genres and those types of films. Because, with Kansas City Confidential, I think it's a really great example of the power of film noir, and specifically like some of the great films of that genre where there weren't these huge set pieces, but there was this great tension created by these criminals and average people like venturing into the criminal world, and how they related with that. And with City on Fire, it's great to see these really exciting set pieces and these Hong Kong action films, which I haven't seen many, but it makes me want to watch more. And in a way, kind of making audiences aware of those genres, which I think we can all agree on, a lot of people hadn't seen, in some cases couldn't even see them. I think that's a kind of a really great effect of drawing some really strong influences and borrowing a lot from those films.
No, but I think that's a good point in the sense that, like, we kind of take for granted right now the accessibility of all kinds of films, or whatever.
Yes.
And okay, maybe in 1992 it was a little different, and like, but also some of the movies he was referencing here, it's like they're not anywhere near as famous as Reservoir Dogs. If Reservoir Dogs is your window into experiencing those movies, all the better for it, right? It's like you are exposed to certain things that you normally wouldn't have been.
Yeah, but in a way, Reservoir Dogs too, I think what's kind of interesting is it's a little unique because he's referenced other movies before that maybe aren't that great. These two just happen to be pretty good. I mean, even though City on Fire has some issues, I kind of really enjoyed watching the film, and
I thought it was great.
Yeah, it's like not a perfect film, but it was a pretty good film, and I enjoyed watching it. And then, like I said, Kansas City Confidential, I'm kicking myself from not having seen it earlier. But again, he's referenced some movies that maybe themselves are not that great, but just have elements that he's borrowed from. Yeah. So what I'm saying is I think you guys put together a pretty good series here.
Yeah.
Great. To recap, we watched Kansas City Confidential, City on Fire, and Reservoir Dogs, and we were talking about how those first two films influenced Tarantino's creation of Reservoir Dogs. Great show. Andy, thanks so much for joining us again. This should be a regular thing.
Well, thanks for having me on. This is a lot of fun, so can't wait to be back.
Awesome.
Most definitely. Next week, we are going to be looking at mockbusters, specifically mockbusters of the movie Jaws. This is going to be a very exciting one. We're watching from 1977. We're watching Orca and Piranha from 1978 and Alligator from 1980. So these are all movies that, and I guess in a way, cashed in on the success of Jaws in the wake of Jaws.
Right. There you go.
But also in many ways, they are very good films on their own. So this is a great little block.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Jaws defined the blockbuster, and so it's kind of appropriate if we're going to talk about mockbusters to start with the first thing that could have a mockbuster, because it's the first thing that was a blockbuster. So I'm pretty excited about that. We'll get into the weeds on that one, and it'll be pretty fun.
Right on.
And plus, at the heart of it, it's Jaws.
Yeah, exactly. I'll take that. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure to subscribe and follow us on all the podcasts and social platforms at the Grindhouse Institute. And to really give us a boost, check us out on Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. This helps us to get noticed. Thanks so much, everybody. We will be back next week.
Ciao.
All right, Ralph. You can go. Sorry we had to detain you.
You're sorry.
These things happen.
Thanks for nothing. Go on, beat it. Maybe you didn't hear what I said. I said for nothing.